Welcome to another insightful session of South Asia Research Institute for Minorities. My name is Heman. I'm a senior research associate. Today, we will embark on an intellectual journey into the complex core of caste, Christianity, and the invented moral panic of love jihad in contemporary India. I'm honored to host a distinguished scholar whose groundbreaking research has shed light in the tapestry of identities and prejudice that shape the world's largest democracy. In the realm of academia, there are more and there are those whose work transcends the boundaries of the ordinary, those who challenges prevailing narrative and engage conversation that reverberate through society. Our guest today is one of such inspiration, an accomplished author, researcher, and scholar whose expertise has claimed international acclaim. She is none other than Dr. Sonja Thomas, an associate professor of women's gender sexuality studies at Colby College. And her scholarship stands at the intersection of feminism, religion, caste in India. Dr. Thomas is the author of the profound and thought-provoking book Privileged Minorities, Syrian Christianity, Gender, and Minority Rights in Post-Colonial India. Her articles have dissected unparalleled insight into the complexities of caste and communalism. Dr. Sonja Thomas will lead us through an enlightening path to greater understanding. This conversation will delve deep into the heart of these issues, confronting biases, unearthing hidden truth, and charting a course towards social justice and inclusivity. Without further ado, let's begin this journey into the world of academia and activism with our estimated guest, Dr. Sonja Thomas. Dr. Thomas, thank you. Firstly, thank you very much for joining us today. I have been analyzing your work and been waiting for this moment, and I'm sure our audience is eager to see this podcast as I have been receiving a lot of messages. So I will start by asking that Dr. Thomas, could you tell us about your academic journey and how initially sparked your interest in the fields of women's gender and sexual studies, as well as your focus on caste, Christianity, and feminism in India?
Well, thank you for having me here and allowing me to speak a little bit about my research. My journey, I have to say, at the beginning, I always loved, I always was attracted to thinking through things from a feminist lens. To me, like when I was introduced to feminist theory as a student in college, and I just really couldn't stop thinking about the way in which our world around us is shaped by inequalities of that pertain to gender and sexuality because of the patriarchy. So I had a natural inclination to history, social sciences, and I was always trying to study gender. So I went on to graduate school, and I thought I was going to study issues of communalism in India and how it was affecting women. But the religious community that I knew the most about was the one that I came from, a Christian community in Kerala, India, and the language I was most familiar with was Malayalam. So I really very naively went into studying like my own community. But what was clear when I started from the very beginning was that a lot of people were not talking about gender in Christian communities or sexuality, and they were not talking about caste. So at the time, we're told as graduate students, do something new. And I was thinking, oh, this is something new. I'm just being honest. I wasn't really thinking about like, I'm going to do caste activism. Because I think with people with caste privilege, you don't really consider things that don't affect you. That changed very quickly. And then I started to think about what is the role of an academic who comes from a dominant caste background and from a community that has for centuries perpetuated casteism. And in my view, the role of a feminist scholar in those enclaves is to hold our own communities accountable and demystify the way in which caste and patriarchy are working to keep casteist and sexist structures alive and to keep the status quo.
So, your research topic and the the things you have written is unique than the other researchers and scholars. Even when talking about your book on privileged minorities, you examine the Syrian Christian community in India and their claims to minority rights and affirmative action. Could you give us a brief overview of how Syrian Christians are and how they position themselves as a model minority, and what are some of the debates within the community around caste privilege and minority status?
Yes, thank you for this question. The Syrian Christians are not from Syria. We tend to think in studies on South Asia and studies in India specifically that Christians were converted by British, so that colonization brought Christianity. That is not exactly the history. This particular Christian community in South India, is specifically in the state of Kerala, believed that St. Thomas the Apostle, so a follower of Jesus Christ, comes to India in the year 52 CE, so very, very early on in Christian history, and converts people, specifically, supposedly along the oral histories, Brahmins, to Christianity. And then we forget sometimes in South Asia studies and studying India that there's another colonizing country called Portugal, who comes to India. I mean, Goans don't forget this, and South Indians don't forget this, but I think in scholarly literature, when we're thinking about Christianity, we often, gloss over what's happening with the Portuguese. But when the Portuguese come in the 15th century and into the 16th century, they start to also bring Christianity and Christian missionaries, and they convert people on the Kerala coast. Mostly fishing caste peoples. So the original Christians, they call themselves original, quote unquote, original or indigenous Christians. They don't believe exactly that they were converted. They believe that they're the original Christians. And they also have a caste difference now between supposed Brahmin roots of the Syrian Christians who practice their mass in the Syriac language, and the Latin Christians who practice in the Latin rite, who supposedly were converted by the Portuguese and of a different caste. So that's a little bit about the history of kind of the Christians of this region. Of course, later the British come and you have Anglican Christians and Protestant Christians, also primarily converted from Dalit Bahujan communities. So I always tell people the very beginnings of Christianity in the world are stratified by caste. So to understand casteism, we can't just understand how it comes from, for example, from a Hindu religion and then is transported onto Christianity. We have to understand how Christians who are privileged with caste work with Hindus who are privileged with caste to push out others, Dalit Bahujan others, from any kind of things like, education or, becoming landholders. So when we understand the dynamics between dominant caste Christians and dominant caste Hindus, we can better understand how casteism functions. Now, for your other question about model minorities, oftentimes it's ones who have the most privilege and status in a particular community that ends up defining what that community looks like for the larger, majority community. And the Syrian Christians have done this very consistently. I look at in my book how they do this through issues of education. The Indian Constitution has a article in it, Article 30-1, that says minorities have the right to establish and administer their own educational institutions. Now, Kerala is a very educated state. The Syrian Christians had the generational wealth and the privilege to be able to get into the education industry very quickly and early on in Kerala and India's state modern history. And over, you see court cases, Supreme Court cases, where the Syrian Christians have a role in defining what a minority right is. Almost at the expense of other Christian minority communities. So I often use this example right now. Many Latin Catholics in the state of Kerala are protesting a shipyard that is being built in Kochi that will displace Latin Catholics and fisher folk. Meanwhile, the dominant caste Christians, the Syrian Christians in the state, especially the Catholics, are having a kind of debate over whether or not the priest should face the congregation or turn their back to the congregation during Mass. So that concern about what priests should do during Mass really is not in conversation with the potential displacement of Latin Catholics, right? So here you can see that Syrian Christians can say, look, we're not disturbing the community, we're the larger community, we're not agitating for any rights. We work with dominant caste Hindus. And so you can see that dominant caste Christians will often meet and talk with and have very friendly relationships with Narendra Modi. While, in other places in North India, we see the destruction of churches and the persecution of Christian minorities. So when you have that kind of thing where dominant caste Christians can work with dominant caste Hindus and present their ideas of what a minority is as the understanding of what a minority is, there's a lack of solidarity between different castes in Christianity. And the Syrian Christians can say that they're the ones that don't cause trouble. They're the model minorities. And I have other examples of this in the book too. I think looking at dowry and marriage is another way in which we can see this. The history of the Christian Succession Act, which really was informed by Syrian Christian experiences of marriage and inheritance, led for a kind of law where Syrian Christians were the ones who defined whether or not women in their community could inherit. And so things like this, you can see again and again that the Syrian Christian community is defining what minority rights are, and at the expense of other Christian religious minorities.
So yeah, absolutely. Most of us do not know the real history or the real examples of what have Christians gone through in India earlier in pre-colonial time. So I'm very eager to delve deeper into this complex topic. As you mentioned, the presence of reform movements within the community. Could you please elaborate on a notable reform initiatives or achievements, possibly from your book Privileged Minority or other relevant sources that demonstrate the goals and impact of these movements?
Yes, I wish I could say that these reform movements within the dominant caste Christian society is changing casteism in the community. But just as there are peoples who are calling for certain reforms, there are others in the community that are interested in keeping a system in place that they benefited from. And with a lot of dominant caste communities, what you have is a lot of fragility in the community to talking about the history and legacy of casteism and the current issues concerning Christians in the state and beyond. Now, what I mean by that is when you have privilege, you don't like to be reminded of it because it makes you feel like you did not earn it yourself. This is especially true for many people in the diaspora. I'm studying now a lot of Indian Christians in the United States. Well, Indian Christians in the United States are a racial minority. They often came by themselves to start a new life for themselves. So they come from a lot of like working hard. So nobody wants to be told, well, you didn't work as hard as a Dalit Christian, because it makes you feel like you didn't earn it. So oftentimes, a lot of people in a dominant caste community will not talk about issues of caste or casteism, and they're very fragile when that discussion of caste comes. But that said, I do see very prominent community members like Father Paul Delacotte, who is the former spokesperson for the dominant caste rite of Catholicism known as the Syro-Malabar rite, speaking out against statements by a bishop that said that Muslims were stealing Christian girls in a love jihad, but also were starting a narcotics jihad. What is interesting, though, when a very prominent person like Father Paul Delacotte speaks out about it's not right to say that Muslims are doing a narcotics jihad, they seem to also be reticent to say anything about what's happening with gender and quote unquote love jihads, right? So while some in the community protested some of these comments about that were Islamophobic, or some in the community protested, say, clerical sexual abuse of bishops, abusing nuns. I also see a large number of prominent peoples, like Cardinal Alan Cherry in the Syro-Malabar faith, who issued a circular letter to be read in all Syrian Christian churches, calling for the nuns to stop protesting clerical sexual abuse. So just as much as I see people in the community calling for reform, I do see a lack of response to take on issues of gender and sexuality. In my current project, I'm looking at the diaspora, and I see a lot of different groups working in the diaspora at reform, like Malayalis for Black Lives, or a group called Transparent Malankara that's trying to talk about and address the trauma of sexual abuse in the Malankara church, or groups trying to help Malayali women heal from generational trauma. A number of young people have reached out to me for more information about how to address casteism in the community, or for guidance on projects about gender and caste within the Syrian Christian community, which I think is entirely new. So while reform and research is going on, we also have to understand there's a lot of fragility and backlash at the same time. And that needs to be addressed. And one of the ways in which we can do that in dominant caste communities is just say, we need to educate ourselves. I'm an educator, and that's where I start from. And that's where I try and give people, like, that is our first step, to educate ourselves on things that we've hidden from ourselves in our own community.
Yeah, I really appreciate your perspective on the reforms movement within the community. I mean, very few people do that. It's even evident that these initiatives play a vital role in reshaping the community's dynamic. Dr. Thomas, your work underlines the paramount significance of unions within the Syrian Christian community. How do these reinforce and perpetuate rigid caste boundaries, and in what ways do they contribute to the preservation and the reaffirmation of the community's caste-based identity?
When we study caste, I'm not biased here, I'm telling the absolute truth. We have to have a feminist lens, because it is gender and sexuality, the intersections of gender and sexuality, that literally reproduce the caste system. This is why marrying within the caste and the faith makes it seem like caste is something natural and inevitable. We'll just say, like, it always is that way, when we have the endogamous union, the arranged marriage system as the norm. And when you normalize heterosexual marriages as the only legitimate when they happen within your caste and faith, then what is happening is that we're also policing any woman who has a kind of oppositional consciousness and marry outside of the community. A quote unquote good woman in the arranged marriage system is one who marries within the caste and faith. And within privileged communities, then that woman can access all the benefits of the caste system and the social capital that comes with something like the cult of domesticity in a Brahmanical patriarchal society. So I discuss this in the book. When you have the endogamous union as something that so is integral to keeping the caste system in place, it engenders a host of assumptions about labor and colorism and heteronormative desires as well. Because, for instance, because the Syrian Christians understand themselves to be Brahmin converts. And in South India, when Brahmins are thought to be Aryan raced and fairer skinned and differentiated from Dravidians, who are thought to, this is an assumption that they're dusky features. It leads to suspicions in dominant caste communities where supposedly a quote unquote fair woman, protected from the sun, doing labor that in the home and not agricultural labor associated with the former slave castes, that if they have a dark child or a darker skinned child, then they must have had an affair with a Dalit Bahujan worker participating in manual labor. And these assumptions about gender and sexuality and children and birth that I'm talking about with colorism stem from long assumptions about that is a history of enslaving Dalit casted labor, of a landlord system where Syrian Christians and dominant caste Hindus became large landowners, and a patriarchal system that allows dominant caste men in communities to have sexual access to Dalit women, but also to their own dominant caste women. And so it polices the boundaries. So when we understand gender and sexuality, then we can understand how the caste system is perpetuated, how certain norms within the community, like marriage, then set particular roles for both dominant caste women and Dalit women in the caste system. So that's where I always say that we have to have a feminist lens when we study caste.
Yeah, yes, even the fact that union reforms caste boundaries is critical point that highlights the challenges faced by marginalized group in Kerala and other parts of India. So coming to your groundbreaking articles, one of your articles, Caste, Christianity and Invented Moral Panic of Love Jihad, as you mentioned in one of your answers, you examine the concept of Love Jihad within the Syrio-Malabar Catholic community in India. Can you provide our audience with a comprehensive understanding of the historical origins and motivation behind this moral panic backed by your research? I'm sure love jihad term is way different what we understood earlier.
Yeah, I think the current literature on love jihads often focuses on the Hindu rite, and talking about Muslim marriages with Hindu peoples, and tracing how like the Hindu rite has historically whipped up communal fears that the Muslim men are stealing our women and force converting Hindu women into Islam. So this kind of trope of this other community, this threat of the other community stealing girls and women from our community, quote unquote, our community, is a common trope used by those with power to try and stoke communal fears of an imagined looming threat. For the Hindu rite, the idea that Muslim peoples are divorcing often, having multiple wives, having multiple children, then stokes a fear that the Muslim community is growing at a faster rate than the Hindu community, and we need to stop it. So in love jihads is part of this rhetoric, this part of this fear rhetoric of whipping up this moral panic that then says we one have to protect our women and restrict them, and make sure that they marry within our community. And two, it makes the community in constant fear of the quote unquote other community, which then justifies the policing of that minority community. But as I looked at in this article that's soon to be published, we often focus on Hindus and Muslims in this rhetoric of love jihad. So we tend not to think about Christians. But what is really interesting is that the Christian community, especially the Syro-Malabar Church, the dominant caste rite of Catholicism in Kerala, India, has been pushing a moral panic of love jihad within the Syro-Malabar Catholic community for over a decade. There have been multiple statements that issued by bishops, by priests, that say that dominant caste Christian women are being stolen away without any evidence. This is actually not happening, right? But that they're being stolen by Muslims, but also a lot of times they'll say by Aishava Hindus, which is a Bahujan community in Kerala. So in this kind of rhetoric, you can see this dominant caste Christian community having a lot of similarities with what the Hindu rite is saying with love jihads. And the fact that this has been said in so many words over and over by the hierarchy within the Syro-Malabar Catholic rite in Kerala shows us that this isn't just something that we should be talking about in Hindu-Muslim relations, but understand how this is a caste element too, where dominant caste Christians are saying the same thing. Right. And to try and this paper that I wrote tries to trace a little bit of the history of why dominant caste Christians are also trying to whip up an invented moral panic of a false accusations of love jihads.
I must say your explanation of historical origins and motivation behind love jihad is illuminating and underscores the importance of understanding the context most importantly. So continuing with our last question, as you highlight the convergence of love jihad allegation with campaigns encouraging Syrio-Malabar Catholic women to have more children. Could you explain the underlying motivation and profound implications of these interrelated narratives within the community as exemplified in your scholarly work?
Yeah, for sure. What is interesting about a lot of the statements that you see these Syro-Malabar priests and bishops say is that oftentimes it's accompanied by calls for Christian women to have more children. So in the early decades of the 20th century, the Syrian Christians were actually the most numerous Christians in the state of Kerala. But family planning initiatives in the Syrian Christian community resulted in declining numbers in the community over the decades. Also, outmigration. Kerala peoples are known to travel everywhere. And a lot of Syrian Christians did travel, especially to the United States and to Europe and to the Gulf. Today, the Syrian Christian community are actually just under half of the Christian population, and their demographic numbers continue to drop. So here you can see that same kind of fear that I was saying before about demographic fears of declining numbers, playing a role in this kind of rhetoric of Christian priests, dominant caste Christian priests saying something about love jihads. So in the article I wrote that you're referencing, I do a decade plus trace of the mentions of love jihads and show how it's accompanied by schemes for women to have more children. For instance, in 2011, the Syro-Malabar Church offered incentives to any family having a fifth child. Things like if you have more than 5 children, they will get free health care or bonds that will mature when the fifth child comes of age. 2 years after that, the Syro-Malabar Cardinal, George Allen Cherry, issued a pastoral letter saying, don't get into mixed marriages. Don't have, marriages across castes or marriages across religions. But he also, in the same letter, says Syro-Malabar Catholic women should have more children. Family planning initiatives that are associated in the same kind of letters against of the fear of love jihads. I mentioned that Bishop Kalarangat in the state of Kerala said this thing about narcotics jihad and love jihads are happening in the state. This actually came, that statement in the summer of 2020, in the fall of 2021, came out at the same time that Bishop Kalarangat, the same bishop, was saying that Syro-Malabar women would have, if you have 5 or more children, that family would get preferred employment in Syrian Christian hospitals, and that they would get, financial assistance of 1,500 rupees for having 4 or 5 or more children. So all of these incentives, and embedded in this idea of you must have more children, and fears of like Muslim men and Ajava Hindus are stealing our girls, is the unstated reality that what we're saying is we don't want more children of a mixed union. We want more children of an endogamous union. This hierarchy wants more Syrian Catholic, Syro-Malabar Catholic children. So the only the marriage that can be imagined is a marriage that is within the community. So while we can identify the Islamophobia in something like saying love jihad and narcotics jihad statement, when we have the endogamous union as the norm, the arranged marriage system as the norm, and when having more children doesn't even need to be qualified with in the faith, in the religion, in the caste, because that's assumed that those more children will be in the same caste and in the same faith, then it is up to us to peel back those layers of the patriarchy and expose how the underbelly of caste functions through these sexual and reproductive controls over women. There's a reason why you're saying a Syro-Malabar priest or bishop is saying love jihads are happening without no evidence, and also saying Syrian Christians need to have more children, because it perpetuates the caste system.
I totally agree that the connection you draw between love jihad and the campaign for more children sheds light on the broader implications and motivation behind these narratives. Coming to your current book project on Indian priests in rural America, you examine the intersection of race, caste, and religion. Could you discuss the theoretical frameworks or analytical tools you are utilizing in this project? How might it build on or depart from your previous work?
Yeah, thank you for giving me the chance to talk about my current research as well. full disclosure, I come from the Syrian Christian community, but I did not grow up in a Syrian Christian community. I grew up in a very sparsely populated area of the United States called Montana. You can think of like cowboys in cowboy hats riding horses and a lot of cows, not a lot of people. So I didn't have a Syrian Christian community. I went to a Latin Catholic church, right? So I didn't know any Syrian Christian families. We didn't have, Indian parties that a lot of people have in urban areas. I didn't have any Indian Americans in my school. We were the only ones, right? Like, so, but what we did have, weirdly, is that, my parents spoke Malayalam in the house. We ate beef curry in the house. We went to church a lot. So my worldview was actually shaped very clearly by Kerala Christian worldviews, and I didn't know it. When I was growing up in the 1980s and into the 1990s, I grew up on the border of another state called North Dakota. And North Dakota started to have these priests come from India. And they all spoke Malayalam. They all seemed very familiar with, palapam and chicken curry, and they all, my father would speak to them about, different intricacies of the Syriac language, and which my dad studied as a child, right? So it was not weird to me. Only when I was doing this research project, my first research project on the Syrian Christians, did I realize that I actually knew a lot of priests in the faith that came to the state of North Dakota and then went back. And then in my home state of Montana, we started to get priests in the 1990s. So I thought I might study, maybe do an article about how weird it was that these priests were coming from Kerala to a very rural area where there's mostly white people or indigenous peoples, and not come to their own community and talk about race and religion. I will say that I was wholly unprepared to think through issues of indigenous rights. One of the theoretical frameworks that I use in this research is from indigenous feminisms. And I'm ashamed to say I did not really understand what decoloniality was until I started to think through the Catholic Church relationship to indigenous peoples in the United States. I first believed that I was studying race and religion in this project, and caste too, because many of these priests are coming from dominant caste communities. But when looking at priests in rural areas, the blood that is on the hands of the Catholic Church as it pertains to Native peoples, from boarding schools to forced conversion to clerical sexual abuse and physical abuse of Native peoples, it's ever apparent and not discussed enough in the Settler Colonial Academy. So that's one framework that I'm using for this scholarship. The other one is critical caste studies and critical race studies. Because I'm looking at networks of migrations, and many of these priests are from dominant caste backgrounds, but not all. Their immigration on religious worker visas to rural and indigenous populations, and how those networks kind of set up with the Syro-Malabar Church and, Latin Catholic churches in the United States. The caste makeup of Indian Americans just in general, which skews very heavily to dominant caste. That is informing this research. I will say it's a departure from my previous research, because I thought I was like part of the community that I was studying in India, because I am by descent a Syrian Christian and I was familiar with the Malayalam language. But this research is much more personal, since I was raised in Eastern Montana and I know many of these priests, their family, friends. My upbringing was so shaped by issues by the Catholic faith, but it was also very shaped by rural cowboy culture. I mean, I don't think that there's many South Asian researchers in the world who have been to rodeos and brandings of calves, right? Like, so I did grow up in that tradition, with that as the norm around me. But I also grew up around Kerala Christian traditions with my own faith growing up. So, and I was shaped by settler colonialism, which has a goal of erasing Native people. So it pretty much tracks that I wasn't really familiar enough with indigenous histories or indigenous feminisms, even though it doesn't make it right. So those are kind of how my theoretical frameworks for this project. But it's how it's also different from being solely based in India. This one is like really global because I'm not just looking at them priests coming to rural areas of the US, but many priests also go to from Kerala to North India, in dioceses in North India, and our missions there, and that factors into their migration to rural communities in the US too. So it's informed a lot by my previous research, but then has taken different theoretical frameworks too.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. And as you have done, Dr. Thomas, advocacy work around recognizing caste is a protected category at Colby College. Could you speak about those efforts and why you see this an important issue? What advice could you have for other higher institutions looking to address caste discrimination?
Yeah, if people are not aware, in the United States, there's a lot of colleges and universities. The city of Seattle, the state of California just signed an ordinance to say that casteism is not permitted in the state of California. It's sitting on Gavin Newsom, the governor of California's desk right now, awaiting his signature. So we when we're thinking about like putting caste as a protected category, what we mean is a lot of colleges and universities have non-discrimination clauses that say we will not discriminate. This institution will not discriminate on the basis of race or sex or sexuality or religion, but oftentimes caste is not in there. And what happens when Dalit Bahujan students or faculty or staff are experiencing discrimination in higher education, they have nowhere to turn. You can't really go to the human resources. You can't go to, we have at Colby College a bias incident reporting mechanism, because if your college doesn't even recognize it, how do you even start the process of providing redress for anybody who experiences this form of discrimination? Now, Colby College was the second college in the United States to recognize caste as a protected category in our non-discrimination clause. And this is where I work. It's a very white state. It's a predominantly white institution. So a lot of people would tell me like, why are you doing this? What a waste of time. There's not that many South Asians there. And one of the great things about working at Colby College is that my institution took the viewpoint that we don't need hundreds of people to be harmed by discrimination for us to get off our butts and to care. If potentially one person is going to be harmed by this form of discrimination, it's enough for us to stand up and say, it's not going to be permitted at our institution. And in that, I feel very lucky and supported at my institution for working on caste protections. Dalit Bahujan peoples can face a lot of discrimination in higher education, and academia is saturated by dominant caste academics, myself included. Many dominant caste academics don't even study caste. So Dalit Bahujan students and professors can face little avenues to turn to, like I said, if they experience caste discrimination, but also if they are trying to work on caste and casteism in their own institution. That's why it's really important for colleges and universities to address caste discrimination. The advice that I have for other higher education institutions looking to address caste discrimination is to find out how your college works. I work at what's called a small liberal arts college, so it's a very small college. It doesn't have graduate students, and we tend to have intimate classes with our students. So, smaller classes where you can have a lot of interaction between professor and students. And we're a type of college that really values what we call the liberal arts education. So, that a class in math is going to be speaking to a class in women's studies. Now that seems weird, but I work with math professors all the time. I have a double major in math and women's studies, so that we can see how gender discrimination in the STEM fields are impacting women going into math, for example, is something that our students can do. And because we have this kind of cross-pollination at a liberal arts institution, one of the ways that Colby really addressed this is to think that we can have education be the foregrounding of how we approach caste protections at our college. So I just gave a lecture, a crash course on what is caste this past Tuesday. Guess who was in the audience? Economics professors, math professors. Right. So that's the kind of way in which we did it at Colby. Other institutions might have things like faculty senates or student government associations where you might want to pass a resolution to get your college or university to address caste. And I have talked to many students in colleges and universities who are starting this process, and it might look different at every different institution. But I think when we get people talking about what our particular institutions are like and what they need, then we can have much more conversations about multiple ways in which colleges and universities can and should be doing putting caste as a protected category in non-discrimination clauses.
Yeah, I appreciate your efforts in recognizing caste as a protected category at Colby College, which is commendable. And they underscore the importance of addressing caste discrimination at educational institution, which is even more important. So, Dr. Thomas, as you earlier mentioned and emphasized the need for the feminist perfect perspective when examining caste dynamics, tell us how this feminist lens reveals the intricate interplay of caste and patriarchy within the Syrian Christian community, drawing your extensive research.
Yeah, I think I mentioned this before, and I don't feel biased saying this. I feel like it's an absolute fact. All research should be feminist. Gender and sexuality cannot be an add-on, especially when we study caste, because of the way in which endogamous unions and Brahmanical patriarchy are integral to the perpetuation of the caste system. And if we don't understand gender and sexuality when we think about caste, or if we leave that research for somebody else to do, oftentimes it's done by feminists who are women, cisgender women in the academy. And if we say like, oh, that's for women to do because I'm not interested in gender or the family or anything like that, then our understandings and comprehensions of how casteism functions will never be complete. We all have to have a feminist lens. With the Syrian Christian community, there are very little studies on gender. One of the reasons for that is because, there's just few studies on Christianity, anyways. When we look at religious minorities in India, we tend to focus on Hindu-Muslim relations because Muslims are the largest minority. That's fine, that's okay. But because Christianity is kind of a later addition, when we study Christianity, it's like, oh, and this asterisk. And this little other community, it's so minuscule. It's only 2.3% of the Indian population is Christian, right? So there are very little studies on Christianity just in general. That's starting to change, I think. But within that Christian scholarship, and especially studying the Syrian Christians, there's a lot of scholarship on how the Western world tried to influence and change and kind of Latinize, make the Eastern Christians of India, who have a long history, change and be more like European Christians. So you often have like a lot of pushback because the Syrian Christian community did hold on to a lot of their traditions. So they push back against this colonial world. So that's not untrue, right? Like that the colonizers tried to change the Syrian Christians. So you have a lot of scholarship on, why Syrian Christians do particular traditions, the keeping of the Syriac language, and the importance of kind of Eastern Rite and Eastern Orthodox traditions. And there's a plethora of literature like that within the community. But those topics don't ever really talk about gender. Because in a Brahmanical patriarchal society, women were not allowed to be part of the church. Women were not allowed to learn Syriac. I do what's called studying up. Oftentimes when we think of oppression, we think like, okay, we need to study the people who are affected by oppression. But I study people, how people uphold oppression. Dominant caste women have benefits from the caste system. So I want to study not just how they participate in casteist structures, but also how by adhering to caste norms, like issues of the endogamous union, they also benefit from the caste system. But they are also under patriarchy, right? So the restrictions on movements, the cult of domesticity that keep them in the home and make them do particular things that, they can't, even though they're educated, they might not be using their education for empowerment. It punishes oppositional consciousness or anybody who would want to marry outside the community. It prevents solidarity between caste and religions. So I take the stance that we can also, if we look at dominant caste communities and study up, we can look at how women within that community benefit from the caste system, but also are restricted under the patriarchy, right? That might prevent them from doing intercaste alliances. And those kind of intricacies of gender in the caste system, I believe, can give us a more holistic view of how casteism is functioning within Christianity.
So, as you are the inspiration, I'm sure for a lot of women out there, but also for your female students, I must tell you that your emphasis on using a feminist lens to analyze caste and patriarchy within the Syrian Christian community is crucial perspective that brings out the nuisance of these complex issues. Throughout your scholarly journey of researching and authoring influential work on caste, Christianity, and communalism, have there been any particular personal experiences or impactful encounters that have significantly shaped or deepened your comprehension of these interesting and multifaceted issues?
Yeah, I mean, there's I most of my research methods are ethnographic in nature, and so I do a lot of interviews, and there are so many that come to mind that have been so impactful for me. But the ones that come to mind most are when we like to think of ourselves as objective researchers. Academics like to think of themselves as objective. But I also am a feminist scholar, and I know that women's stories matter. The most vulnerable community stories need to be told and not bowled over. So I come at research wanting to have those stories be amplified. And sometimes I realize that wanting to amplify those stories also has made me think a particular way without realizing it. And some of the most impactful stories and interviews that I've done are ones that make me rethink. Like, for instance, with studying Indian priests in the United States, I was very much thinking, why is the Catholic Church globally invested in white populations in the United States that are literally dying, they're aging, and getting a priest from India who might have hundreds of congregants and might be running a school with hundreds of students in it, to leave that bulk of their population and come and administer to a church that has maybe 20 congregants in the pews. And I thought this was just because of the Catholic Church is invested in where the global north. The Catholic Church is invested in white peoples and not in brown populations. But I was talking to an Indian priest about coming over and the work that he was doing in rural Montana. And they told me, and I was kind of asking questions like this, like if you had thousands of congregants in your church in India, why would you leave that to 20 people here? And the priest said to me, well, who are we to judge that one baptism means more than another? If I perform 20 baptisms in India and I perform one baptism here in Montana, doesn't this person who has a child who wants to be baptized matter? This person matters. And it made me think about labor differently. That a lot of times when we think about South Asians and Indians in the United States, we think that they're taking our jobs. They're doing this labor that, doesn't make them interact with the community. If we think of like software professionals, they can have their own Indian communities and not interact with white or Black or Latino populations in the same way. But a priest might perform a wedding, might perform a baptism, which really uniquely ties their labor to the community in ways. So it made me rethink what spiritual labor is. Another example is a farmer who told me that was so close to an Indian priest. We might think of rural white communities in the United States being very xenophobic and not wanting to interact with any other races. And this this farmer told me, like, I never went on a plane before, but when that priest asked me to go to their jubilee in India, I went and got a passport. And just the idea that these people in Montana or North Dakota don't have any transnational worldviews, they're very insulated and very white communities. Here's something that challenged that in my interview. Other things like interviewing elderly women in India who told me about, the clothing that they wore, and they're, talking to their parents and saying, I don't want to wear the kunika, which is a large gold hooped earring, and fighting with their parents saying, I'm not going to wear that. I'm going to be a little bit more modern and wear earrings. These stories that had never been told before. I had a elderly woman tell me that, like, you're the only person in my whole life who's asked me any of these questions, right? So these are ones that stay with me, deeply personal, and make me think through the kind of multifaceted issues of labor, of gender, of relationships with communities.
It's really fascinating to hear how your personal experiences have shaped your understanding of these multifaceted issues. As we conclude our conversation, what are the central takeaways that you aim from our audience to glean from your rich research and insightful analysis of love jihad, caste dynamics, and religious identity, both in India and beyond?
Takeaways. So I think one from my research, since I look so much about, I study up so much, that I think one is if there are dominant caste peoples who are listening to this podcast, speaking about casteism in dominant caste communities can become difficult because of caste fragility. Like I said, I think it's easier to study down and to talk about caste atrocities that are perpetuated than for any dominant caste person to talk about how their community, their own community that they come from, is perpetuating it. So I think one takeaway is to just really admit that dominant caste peoples have a lot of work to do. So much work to do. And we can start by thinking about how our own communities uphold caste apartheid and participate in casteist practices. I think that's one takeaway. And in the United States, I would say, like, another takeaway is, like, to understand that there are a lot of intricacies here, and it's not hard to kind of peel out back the intricacies, but we want to just simplify. And I would say that one of the takeaways that I would hope that people would have is, like, simplification can also lead to an obscuring of the issue. Like in the United States, there's a lot of discussion about, if we mention caste in a non-discrimination policy, then the South Asian community, and specifically a religious minority community, a Hindu community, is going to be targeted. And so when people say that, like, we recognize caste, we're targeting Hindus, I kind of try and tell people, look, I focus on a religious minority community in India. And it is true that religious minorities can face discrimination, but it's also true that religious minorities can have caste privilege. So one of the takeaways I hope to show is that two things can exist at the same time. You can have privilege and you can have a minority identity. You can be a religious community that is a religious minority, but that religious minority community can also perpetuate casteism. And we have to hold those two things in our mind and not assume that a numeric minority means a lack of power or vulnerability. I think that's probably why I called my book Privileged Minorities.
Your central takeaways from your research provides a valuable roadmap for promoting social justice and inclusivity. I must say that Dr. Sonja Thomas has unrevealed the complexities of caste, religion, social norms, and lahjat in India. I'm immensely grateful to Dr. Thomas for sharing her perspectives and insights. Let's carry these lessons forward and dismantling biases and striving for more inclusive world. Thank you very much, Dr. Thomas.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been wonderful to talk about this. Thank you.
It's our pleasure.